The Confederate forces were reeling from the staggering losses sustained at the Battle of the Wilderness just days earlier, where the brutal close-quarter fighting had decimated their ranks. With no reinforcements on the horizon, Lee's strategic options were severely limited. He had to rely on hastily constructed earthworks and the sheer determination of the men to hold a line against the relentless Union assault. This stark landscape of desperation and defiance encapsulates the dire straits in which the Confederate Army found itself, fighting not just for victory, but for survival. U.S. Grant was determined to fight all summer long if he had to in order to take Richmond. So on the evening of May the 7th, he started his infantry toward Spotsylvania Courthouse in a desperate race to beat Robert E. Lee to his objective. After supper on the 7th, the Texas Brigade, which was still under the command of John Gregg, was given an extra day's ration of cornmeal and bacon and moved out in a race to beat Grant to Spotsylvania. Marching all night long, the Texans reached the Blockhouse Bridge at the Po River just outside of Spotsylvania, beating Warren's 5th Corps to the crossroads, and settled in for a breakfast of cold rations. After breakfast, Field's division, which included the Texans, advanced towards the village of Spotsylvania Courthouse to confront Brigadier General James Wilson's Federal cavalry, who promptly withdrew. Upon returning to Laurel Hill, the Texans spent the entire night of May the 8th diligently building entrenchments and artillery positions, utilizing tin cups, plates, and any available fence rails. On May the 10th, General Grant launched a major offensive against the Confederate defenses, targeting their left flank. The Union's multiple assaults heavily impacted the Texas Brigade, amongst others. Grant had marshaled 40,000 troops to strike at Anderson and Ewell's corps. 3 full Federal divisions concentrated their attack on the trenches left of the Muleshoe, defended by the Texans in the left center of the Confederate line. A fierce battle erupted, but with deadly accurate fire from behind fortified breastworks and trenches, the first 2 massive Union attacks were defeated. Following these assaults, John Gregg ordered his men to collect rifles and ammunition from the Union dead and wounded in front of their breastworks, bracing for another wave of attacks. The third and final attack occurred at 7 p.m., when the Federals emerged from cover and launched their assault. The 4th and 5th Texas, along with the 3rd Arkansas, managed to check the attack. However, the 1st Texas struggled against the onslaught. The Union forces broke into their defenses, leading to intense hand-to-hand combat. It wasn't until the 3rd Arkansas, 4th and 5th Texas delivered flanking fire that the Federals were forced to retreat in disarray. After the action on May the 10th, the Texans, although not involved in any of the heavy action at the Muleshoe and Bloody Angle, remained under constant fire from Union snipers until, on May the 21st, Grant once again disengaged and moved south, attempting to turn Lee's right flank and reach Richmond. After 2 days of fighting at the North Anna River, where the Texas Brigade wasn't engaged, Grant once again moved to the southeast to the crossroads at Cold Harbor. We're at the Cold Harbor battlefield just behind the Visitor Center. This was familiar ground for the Texans. The Gaines Mill battlefield, where they'd fought just 2 years earlier during the 7 Days campaign, lies about a mile to the south of us. And about a mile behind us are the strategic crossroads of Old Cold Harbor that Philip Sheridan's Union cavalry captured on June the 1st, 1864. About a half a mile north of us, Gregg's Texas Brigade was just arriving and starting to dig their earthwork defenses. All day on the 2nd, the Texans worked to build these breastworks, using cups, canteens cut in half, and their bayonets. Less than 300 yards separated the Union and Confederate lines. Anderson's Georgians and Law's Alabamians were on the left, and Hunton's Virginians were on the right. At 4:30 a.m. on June the 3rd, Grant attacked, with the Ohio and Pennsylvania troops leading the charge. Joseph B. Polley, a corporal in the 4th Texas, wrote in his book,
"The charge of the Federals was gallant enough to deserve success. They came forward in 4 lines about 50 yards apart, and thus presented the fairest of targets for the Texas and Arkansas marksmanship. The slaughter was terrible. In 15 minutes, their struggle lasted. 10,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded.
He went on to say,
At 9 o'clock the same morning, Grant ordered the assault renewed. But not a man in the Union ranks moved forward, for not a man of them but knew it was suicidal.
By 1:30 p.m., Grant suspended offensive operations. The field of battle was thick with the wounded and dead. One last entry into a Union soldier's diary said,
June 3rd, Cold Harbor. I was killed.
Whenever I talk to my students, or even I just think about what happened at Cold Harbor, there's been a debate among historians as to whether tactically it was correct, strategically it made sense, but I always go back to what Grant wrote in his memoirs, reflecting on his career in the war and the many, many operations that he directed. He said there was really only one thing that he regretted that he might take back if he could possibly do that, and that was the charges at Cold Harbor in June 1864.
For 4 days after the Battle of Cold Harbor, the Union dead lay in the hot Virginia sun. Ulysses S. Grant, reluctant to ask for a truce to bury his dead, for fear he would admit defeat.
Until nightfall of June 7th, the Texas Brigade remained at Cold Harbor with no change of position. The stench of the unburied, rotting corpses of the Federals slain on the 3rd constantly in our nostrils.
After another setback in his attempt to capture Richmond, General Grant adjusted his strategy. Instead of continuing his flanking maneuvers and direct assaults on Lee's army, he focused on Petersburg, 20 miles south of Richmond, hoping to cut off the rail lines and supplies sustaining the Confederate capital. On June the 12th, the Army of the Potomac abandoned Cold Harbor and began their march towards Petersburg. The very next day, on June the 13th, Richard Anderson's First Corps, which included the Texas Brigade, left their trenches to follow. They crossed the Chickahominy and James Rivers, and by the morning of June the 16th, the Texans were entrenched in an old line of earthworks at Bermuda 100. Benjamin Butler's Federals, who'd been entrenched there since early May, occupied yet another set of earthworks at the crest of the hill. Late in the afternoon, George Pickett's Virginians, positioned to the left of the Texans, initiated a reconnaissance in force. What started out as a probe quickly escalated into a full-scale assault. Not wanting to be left out, the Texans joined in. The Union soldiers facing the Texas Brigade quickly broke and ran, leaving the breastworks to be taken without opposition. The siege of Petersburg began on the 18th of June, 1864, and the Texas Brigade spent the hot summer around Petersburg until the 28th of July, when it moved north to follow Union General Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps across the James River. The Texans spent the month of August 1864 in and around Richmond until on August the 21st, they were ordered to take position at the Phillips House and to monitor the movements of General Butler's U.S. colored troops at Deep Bottom, where they would spend the next 5 weeks. By this time, 3 years into the war, the Texans were sorely homesick. Captain Tacitus Clay wrote home to his wife Betty.
I dislike this at all times, but particularly at this juncture of affair. I long for peace myself and the blessings attended it. Home, my wife and children.
In yet another attempt to take Richmond, Grant sent Benjamin Butler's army across the James River at Bermuda 100 and attacked Forts Harrison and Gilmer on September the 29th, 1864. First Lieutenant James Pickens of the 3rd Arkansas later wrote about the battle in the Confederate Veteran magazine.
On the night before the fight, I was in command of all the pickets of Hood's old Texas Brigade. I was fully convinced that the enemy was crossing with a heavy force to the north side. All night we could hear distinctly the rolling of artillery and wagons over the pontoon bridge. I notified General Gregg, our brigade commander, of the facts about midnight, sending one of my pickets with the information. Later on, we could plainly hear the enemy forming in our front. About 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I went in person to warn General Gregg of the danger of a sudden attack at daylight. Just before day, I had the outer pickets withdrawn to reservation line, with instructions to hold the line as long as possible and then to fall back slowly. As anticipated, just at the break of day, the enemy charged us with a solid line of battle. In fact, I think there were 2 or 3 lines, all Negro troops. We had a brisk running fight until we reached the breastworks, where we found our brigade all in the works, ready for the charge. I want to say in this connection that, in my opinion, no troops up to that time had fought us with more bravery than did those Negroes. That morning, our brigade occupied the valley of Deep Bottom Creek. The left of the 3rd Arkansas rested on the creek, which was the left regiment of the brigade. General Gary's cavalry was to our left. I think Benning's Georgia Brigade was to our right. The fight lasted only about 1 hour. I am sure there were several hundred dead Negroes left on the field. The dead almost dammed up Deep Bottom Creek at one place. We certainly repulsed them with great slaughter. Soon after this, we were withdrawn and double-quicked up the road toward Richmond, and when we got to Fort Gilmer, we learned that Fort Harrison had been captured. This fort is between Gilmer and the James River, and our brigade had taken position in works between Gilmer and Harrison. At that time, there were no troops to the left or east of Fort Gilmer. The Negro troops and some white assaulted Fort Gilmer and the works to the left of the fort. I have thought that the 3rd Arkansas Regiment saved Fort Gilmer on that occasion. There was a race between the 3rd Arkansas and the 9th Maine Regiment for possession of the works to the left of Fort Gilmer, and our regiment occupied the works in time to save the fort. We had a hand-to-hand fight with the 9th Maine, in which we captured their colors and drove them back with considerable loss. The Negro troops assaulted Fort Gilmer, and in attempting to scale the walls, a great many lost their lives. The Federals continued to hold Fort Harrison to the end of the war. We made an effort to recapture it, but failed with considerable loss. All this was a long time ago, and it may be my memory is not correct on all points. I have written the facts to the best of my memory.
The last significant battle for the Texas Brigade came about a week later on October the 7th, 1864, when Lee launched an attack here along Darbytown Road to try to reclaim some of the territory that he'd lost around Fort Harrison. The fighting was fierce, and the Texans were up against an overwhelming number of Union forces armed with Spencer carbines. Brigadier General John Gregg, who was the heart and soul of the brigade, was leading his men when he was struck by a bullet to the neck and killed instantly. As the men fell back into the woods from the murderous fire, the body of General Gregg lay motionless in a pool of blood on Darbytown Road. Lieutenant John Shotwell from his staff and 3 privates volunteered to retrieve his body. Braving a hail of gunfire, the gallant party retrieved his body, wrapped it in a blanket, and brought it to safety. He fell on the battlefield, his leadership and life cut short in an instant. His loss was devastating for the brigade. J.B. Polley was also wounded in the chaos of the battle and recovered, but Tacitus Clay wasn't as lucky. He took a hit that shattered his leg, and the only way to save his life was to amputate. He survived, but his fighting days were over, and he returned to Texas. The battle for Darbytown Road was another bloody chapter in the brigade's history. With Gregg gone and many of the men wounded, the road to Appomattox became even more difficult. These Texans paid the price for their commitment to the cause, and their sacrifice would never be forgotten. On October the 10th, the Richmond Daily Dispatch wrote an article describing the funeral of General Gregg.
At 3:30 yesterday afternoon, a large concourse of ladies and gentlemen assembled in and around the Capitol for the purpose of showing their respect to the memory of the late lamented General John Gregg of Texas, who was killed on Friday morning last in the fight which took place below Richmond. The body had previously been brought here and taken to the undertaking establishment of John A. Belvin, where it was encased in a coffin, and from thence removed on Saturday to the hall of the House of Representatives in the Capitol building to await the hour appointed for the funeral to take place. At the hour above named, his remains were placed in the hearse, which was drawn by 4 white horses, and followed by the members of his old brigade, the State Guard, a company of artillery, several distinguished civilians and military officers, together with a number of mourners and friends. The cortege proceeded to Hollywood Cemetery, where appropriate services were performed by Reverend James A. Duncan, after which his body was deposited in a private vault to await removal to his native state. Among those who acted as pallbearers were Generals Fields, Bragg, Corse, and Pendleton, Judge Reagan, Colonel Kane, and Dr. Charles McGill. The procession was a very large one, and taken all together, it was one of the most impressive and imposing displays which has taken place in this city on any similar occasion.
The war was effectively over for the Texas Brigade, and for a brief period in early 1865, it looked like the Texas Brigade might cease to exist. The Confederate Congress had passed the Consolidation Bill to join understrength units to create more effective fighting units, and the Texans surely fit that bill. The brigade fought consolidation, though. They'd fought as the Texas Brigade since 1861 and had played pivotal roles in the defining battles of the war, and did not now want to lose their identity. They elected Major Howdy Martin to bypass the chain of command and take their case directly to President Davis. Martin met with Davis and Robert E. Lee and came away with a promise from Davis that as long as there is a man to carry the battle flag, you shall remain a brigade. A quote that lives on today, inscribed on the Texas Brigade Monument on the state capitol grounds in Austin. On April the 9th, 1865, Hood's Texas Brigade faced the inevitable. At Appomattox, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. The proud Texans who'd fought from the beginning of the war were among the last to lay down their arms. Out of thousands who'd marched off to war, only 617 men remained to surrender. They'd given everything they had, but now the fight was over. The Texas Brigade, battered but not broken, marched into history. Hi, I'm Johnny Anderson. I hope you've enjoyed following the journey of Hood's Texas Brigade with us. We've worked hard to honor the legacy of these brave Texans who served with distinction in the Confederacy's most storied fighting unit. Thank you for joining us as we remember their courage and sacrifice.